What is in vivo coding? In vivo literally means in life, and it's used to describe in qualitative analysis when you use the participant's own words and terminologies to summarize or label the text. You might be more familiar with the concept of in vitro. In vitro you hear used for test tubes, for laboratory experiments, and that's in glass. And in some ways you might think that the codes that you create as a qualitative researcher when you're using your own codes with your own words and your own terminology, that's a little bit more like an in vitro approach. You are basically constructing something which contains and summarizes the participants' phrases and words. But in vivo coding, you are not imposing your own interpretation, you're using the participants' own words to summarize and label that text. So it can also be called verbatim or natural or even literal coding. But in each case, it's using the participants' own words. So an example would be if somebody said, "I'm really shocked to hear that," then you would label that as shocked or shocked to hear. So you're being very careful about using exactly the same terminology and phrases that they have. And it's a very useful process for going through and summarizing qualitative data. When you've got a very detailed long transcript of an interview or a focus group, reading it all the way through is a very laborious process. But if you do go through and do a sort of in vivo approach, line by line coding, where you summarize using the kind of keywords and phrases that you're using, it becomes a lot quicker to skim through the data and kind of get a sense of what kind of things people are talking about and the language that they're using. So in this way, you can often see in vivo coding as being the first stage in grounded theory. You'd often do this before going on to create kind of higher level codes. You consider this part of the open coding process if you're doing open and axial coding. Axial coding would then be the next step. So you're kind of pulling things together from the in vivo codes. But you don't have to use in vivo coding in either of these approaches. And you don't have to go any further than doing the in vivo coding. So obviously you don't have to do line by line coding. You don't have to code every line if you're using in vivo coding. You can just summarize the important sentences and the key bits which help you kind of see what's going on in the data. And there are many different ways that you can actually do this practically. So the first way is to do it on paper. If I'm doing this from a transcript I have on the computer, I usually try and format the columns in Word. So I've got a nice long column on the left. And that means that then when I print it out, I've got lots of space on the left to kind of write my summary. And then I'll go through underlining the key bits and then writing out using the in vivo code. So exactly the words that the participants are using for each line. The other way that you can do this works really well, and Johnny Saldana recommends a lot, is to use Excel. So if you have different columns in Excel, you have a column on the right which has the transcript, the text of your data, and then one column to the left of that which is for your in vivo codes, so where you're creating the little summary, and then you have another column to the left of that as well, which is where you probably eventually put your kind of themes or your kind of higher level codes where you start grouping what people are saying together. You can also of course do it in qualitative analysis software. So this is how you do it in Quirkos using the memos feature. So memo features lets you attach a little tag of text, a bit like a post-it note, to a particular part of the transcript, and then you can summarize that using the keywords that you've chosen, those in vivo words, and then you can go back and you can click on the memo and then code those results directly to a theme or another code which you've created later. So when you finish the in vivo process, you've gone through and done this kind of summary for each of your transcripts and through the whole of each transcript. You would then go and probably start to group those things together. So pull out themes that were reoccurring, bringing them into kind of like higher order, higher level codes. And that will help you kind of start to see across the data and commonalities about what people are talking about, even if they're not using identical words. But of course, if they do start to use exactly the same terminology and words like shocked or anxious, then that's very interesting itself, and you want to kind of preserve that as much as possible in your analysis. So what's the difference between in vivo coding and discourse analysis? Because discourse analysis is also looking at the words and the way people express themselves and use language. Well, There is definitely an overlap, and both processes can be used together. The general difference is that discourse analysis is looking at a kind of wider discourse, so a shared language between usually groups of people. So for example, doctors and lawyers may use similar terminology. Policy documents, legal documents will have its own kind of language, formal language that it uses. And even if you're looking at kind of gangs and slang and things like that. So that's kind of looking at language kind of across participants, whereas you could argue that in vivo coding is looking very specifically on a kind of not only just a case by case basis, but a line by line basis at exactly the words and how people are describing themselves. So don't forget to download the free trial of Quirkos. You can download it and see how easy it makes doing qualitative analysis. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the video. If you press the bell and the notification button, we'll be able to let you know whenever we've got a new video or if we've got a live tutorial webinar series coming up.